gratitude and highest heart love. Welcome to the YouTube live book reading of Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare by Vern and Bonnie Bullough. So, we did it again. Welcome. We are getting closer to the end of this wonderful reading, this wonderful book reading. Thank you all for coming to your place on YouTube to read books and learn. I'm your moderator and narrator, Uriel NEVEU. So, it's time for chapter 7. This is a good one too. Man, these are all such good chapters, right? Especially now that where we are in the world. It's like it just all makes sense when we see how everything has panned out. So here we go. We're at page 129, the beginning of chapter 7, mental health and mental illness. Mental health and mental illness. A dominant theme of this book has been that both poverty and ethnic identity need to be considered in any explanation of minority health problems. This is as true of mental health as it is of physical health. Nevertheless, some words of caution have to be given. This is true because there has always been a tendency to blame the ills of society on the poor, to indicate that the poor are poor because they are feeble, less able, or mentally ill. This is the implication of the 1856 report, which stated that the pauper class in Massachusetts furnished proportionately 64 times as many cases of insanity as the independent class. While there is a correlation between mental illness and socioeconomic status, the relationship is a complex one, which has only begun to become evident through the research of the last 30 or 40 years. A pioneering study in the field done in Chicago by Robert E. L. Farris and H. Warren Dunham was published in 1939. The two investigators found that patients who were diagnosed as schizophrenic were most likely to have home addresses near the central part of the city, in the slum and rooming house neighborhoods, while patients who were diagnosed as manic depressive were scattered throughout the whole city. Since schizophrenia was the most common type of functional psychosis, the high rate of this disease found in poverty neighborhoods helped account for the correlation between hospitalization and low socioeconomic status. In trying to explain their findings, Farris and Dunham hypothesized that schizophrenia might be more common in poverty neighborhoods because people in such areas felt a greater sense of isolation owing to the social disorganization of their neighborhood. This interpretation touched off a lively debate that is still going on. On the one hand, researchers have found that slums are not particularly disorganized, only that their social structure is different from that of the more affluent neighborhoods. On the other hand, the much more basically The interpretation has been challenged because it implies a causal chain between poverty and schizophrenia. Later researchers, including Dunham himself, have argued that poverty might be a consequence of schizophrenia rather than its cause. The schizophrenic individual may drift down to live in a poor neighborhood because of the socially debilitating symptoms of his illness. Since the possible explanations have such great social consequences, the research has become voluminous. In a review of 44 major empirical studies investigating the relationship of socioeconomic status and psychological disorders, Bruce and Barbara Doharin found that in spite of differences in design, the vast majority of studies reported that psychological disorders were more common among poor people than among middle or upper class individuals. Usually, it was the lowest class of or stratum, no matter how defined, which had the largest population of the mentally ill. This concluded that although the interpretations of the data might be subject to debate, there could be little quarrel with the basic correlation between poverty and psychological disorders. Welcome all. Look at that. Peace, everyone. Highest heart love. Thank you for reading with us. We're in we're 2 chapters away right now, guys. We're in chapter 7, right? And so this is mental health and mental illness. We're at the bottom of page 130. The complexity of the problem. The causes of this correlation is still being investigated. A methodological problem inherent in the research is how to define, headed by August Hollingshead and Frederick Redlick, use diagnosed illness to define operationally what they meant by a psychiatric disorder. To find their sample, they contacted all of the mental hospitals, private psychiatrists, and clinics in the area for patients diagnosed as having mental illness. They then classified the residents of New Haven into 5 social classes, a not particularly difficult thing to do since New Haven, the home of Yale University, had already been the subject of several studies of class structure. They again found that the poor people were more likely to be diagnosed as having some type of psychiatric disorder than those who were richer. Due they believed to the stress of living in a lower class environment. They found that there were significant differences depending upon a person's social class in the type of diagnosis given. Psychosis, for example, were more commonly diagnosed among the 2 lowest of the 5 classes, while neurosis were more often found among the 5 classes, the top 3 classes. The finding in not so clear cut as it might seem, since it could mean either that the stress of poverty produced more serious types of mental illness, or it could also suggest that psychotherapists are more likely to diagnose an illness as a neurosis if the patient is from a middle or upper class, but will call it a psychosis if the patient comes from a lower social class. The New Haven study was also criticized because it included only diagnosed illness. A Midtown Manhattan study under the direction of Leo Schroll and another team of psychiatrists and sociologists attempted to broaden the definition of mental illness to include persons not under treatment. They gathered data by means of a lengthy interview in which a random sample of people in different strata of society indicated their own feelings and problems. Their mental health status was determined by their answers to the questions. This procedure made the incidence of mental illness seem much higher because it included all of the untreated cases. But the proportion of disorders was still highest among the lowest social strata. In an attempt to determine whether poverty was the cause or consequence of these symptoms, the investigators looked also at the social class of the parents of the people they interviewed. Although they did find that those persons whose parents were of low social class were more likely to report symptoms or be diagnosed as ill, the individual's own social class was more strongly related to the probability of his having a mental disorder than that of his parents. Mental illness, in fact, occurred more often among the people who were downwardly mobile than those who moved up the social scale during their lifetime. Peace, peace, everyone. This is good, right? I know. Poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare. These correlations are magnificent, especially to see where we are right now, right? In a sense, we are back to the original findings of Ferris and Dunham, but still without any degree of certainty. The main reason for replication of studies and cautious concern about the link between socioeconomic status and psychiatric disorders is that researchers are still unsure about the cause of many mental illnesses. The studies linking poverty and mental illness suggest there is a sociogenic relationship. Psychiatrists, following the lead of Sigmund Freud, have customarily attributed most symptoms of mental illness to stress of early childhood experiences and problems in family interactions. In turn, they have tended to discount most of the later stresses, which sociologists feel are so important. A more recent trend, particularly in the research about schizophrenia, has been to re emphasize the role of biological determinants, particularly possible genetic causes. Several studies in which twins were utilized as research subjects have raised questions about the nature of schizophrenia. It has been found that a schizophrenic monozygotic twin is more likely to have a twin who is afflicted than a schizophrenic whose twin is not identical. Woo! This deep. These findings are also supported by other family surveys, which reinforce the concept that there is an hereditary tendency to develop the disease. Nevertheless, most authorities still believe that there are also environmental influences in the development of schizophrenia. A comparison with tuberculosis is often made because tuberculosis is both an organic disease and an environmental disease. Similarly, schizophrenia now seems to be caused by a combination of biological, social, and psychological elements, with poverty implicated as one of the crucial social elements in this causal chain. The unwillingness to discard the factor of environment is in part due to the fact that it enters into the mental health picture in so many other ways. The New Haven survey mentioned above had a 10-year follow-up study of the patients identified as mentally ill in the initial study. In this research, it was found that people received a different type of treatment depending upon their social class position. Middle and upper class patients were more likely to have received psychotherapy or somatotherapy and were able to be cared for on an outpatient basis or in a doctor's office. Their families were not only better able to pay for the therapy, but they were also willing to tolerate the ill person at home, either because they had more ample housing or could hire outside help if needed. Lower class patients, on the other hand, had seldom received any effective therapy. They were more likely to have been committed to a long term public facility where they received little more than custodial care mingled with some drug therapy. They drifted into chronic mental illness, disappearing into the back wards of the state mental hospitals. These differences in treatment patterns are important in explaining the higher overall percentage of mental illness among people with low incomes, regardless of the position one takes on the causality of mental illness. Most experts agree that the present state of psychotherapy leaves much to be desired, but that it is still the most effective treatment modality developed to date. At the crowded mental hospitals where most of the poor end up, there are so few psychotherapists that the care offered must be classed as primarily custodial. Tied in with this finding is the nature of long term hospitalization itself. Irving Goffman believes that long term hospitalization in a total institution, such as a mental hospital, actually causes people to behave in peculiar ways. The stress begins with the admission procedures themselves, which strip the patient of his individual identity. In order to cope with his inmate status, the patient then develops either an apathetic posture or takes on some special, peculiar coping mechanism, which makes him seem not quite sane. What is diagnosed as psychopathology can well be a realistic response to the hospitalization experience. This means that the individual who is admitted to a mental hospital, particularly one of the larger public institutions, is at a marked disadvantage in comparison to the person who can be treated in his accustomed surroundings. Finances are not the only barrier between lower class patients and psychotherapists. Psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and psychiatric social workers tend to be recruited almost exclusively from the middle and upper class backgrounds, and until recently, the only ethnic minority well represented in the group were Jews. Since this is the case, it is possible that therapists are afflicted with a certain amount of class and racial ethnocentrism. That makes sense, right? This prejudice is clearly evident in the types of patients whom the psychotherapists choose for therapy. It has been shown, for example, that they tend to avoid patients whose education has been meager or whose occupations are unskilled. Such exclusions is justified on the grounds that the lower class patient cannot verbalize adequately or that he does not have the necessary cognitive skills to participate in the therapeutic process. This is undoubtedly true, but the same type of statement can be made about children, and psychotherapists have found ways to deal with youngsters. It seems rather that the psychotherapists do not feel the same empathy for the problems of the lower class patients that they do for those patients whose problems are similar to their own. Unfortunately, this generalization tends to be true even for those few therapists whose origins were lower middle class or lower class. This means that psychotherapy in or out of the hospital is simply not available to most poor or minority patients. Thank you all for being here. We are in the middle of page 134, reading from this wonderful chapter about mental health and mental illness. So here we go, reading from this wonderful, powerful book, Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare. So we're seeing some very big correlations right here. Here we go. Ethnic identity and mental illness. Middle of page 134. It is not only the relationship of poverty and mental illness which is a matter of debate, but even more controversial is the relationship of ethnic identity to the incidence of psychosis and neurosis. Much of the difficulty comes from the fact that there is considerably more polemics than hard research in the field. Writers from the right try to prove that one group is inferior to another, while writers from the left argue that the present social structure needs reform. Although we would fall into the second category, it seems obvious that most effective reforms should be based upon objective findings. Unfortunately, the evidence is not all clear since, as Benjamin Passamanik pointed out, most of the investigators in the past have demonstrated bias, either in the collection of the data or in its interpretation. The controversy in the United States goes back at least to the census of 1840, which found that the rates of the institutionalization for Negroes was higher in the North than in the South. Advocates of slavery immediately interpreted this as meaning that the innately inferior Negroes fared better under slavery than they did living as a freemen in the North. Ignored in polemics was the fact that the South had fewer institutions than the North, and that the institutions of slavery itself could afford to be somewhat tolerant to certain kinds of mental disorder that induce greater submission. Moreover, the South was much more rural than the North, and it is in the urban centers where the mentally ill were most likely to be institutionalized. However, the same kind of conclusion appeared in some of the studies in 1880 when there was growing hostility toward immigrants, particularly the Irish Catholics. The official census report of that year stated that there was an extraordinary ratio of insanity among the foreign born. As we try to escape the biases of the past, however, we still must report that the Negro admission rates are higher in the mental hospitals in proportion to population, and Negroes stay longer in the hospital than do white patients. How much is this an indication of racial predisposition, and how much is due to poverty? When socioeconomic status is carefully controlled, psychosis rates among Negroes and whites appear to be similar. This implies that the higher rates of hospitalization are due more to poverty than to any ethnic identity. Of some 8 studies collected by the Darwins to compare the rates of psychological disorder among Negro and white populations. Four report higher rates for Negroes, and four report higher rates for whites. The evidence is even more contradictory than this brief summary would indicate. The Doerans themselves, for example, found a high incidence of self-reported psychiatric symptoms among Puerto Ricans in New York City and a low incidence for Negroes. In Texas, E. Gartley Jace found a lower incidence of diagnosed psychosis among the Spanish surname population than among either Anglos or non-whites. The only thing one can conclude from the available evidence is that there is at present no proven correlation between ethnic identity and the type of psychosis, such as schizophrenia, in which an individual loses contact with reality. Personality damage. These findings do not mean, however, that there are not much more subtle correlations between race and poverty and mental illness. In fact, the most serious mental health consequence of minority status might well be the damage which poverty and discrimination inflict on the attitudes and intellectual development of the growing child. Generations of researchers have found that both race and socioeconomic status correlate significantly with all of the common measurements of intelligence. Moreover, the effects of both race and socioeconomic status tend, at least at times, to be additive. This is evidenced by the fact that in many studies of intelligence, poor white children score higher than poor black children, but neither group scores as well as families with adequate incomes. Complicating the nature of the findings is another argument between nature versus nurture. Arthur Jensen was able to shake the scholarly world of educational psychology a few years ago when he made a strong case for the genetic determinants of IQ. Jensen believed that compensatory education was a failure, and the reason it had failed was because educators had neglected to take account of the importance of the genetic factor of predicting intelligence levels. He suggested that there might well be inherited racial or social class differences in ability that doomed all such educational efforts to failure. Jensen became the focus of a sharp controversy because many people felt that he superior and inferior races. Certainly, Jensen tended to lend support to some of the racist arguments, but what is needed either to prove or disprove his assertions is more serious biological research. Until such evidence is forthcoming, the debate is more or less meaningless. Most authorities agree that regardless of biological potential, environmental factors still play a crucial role in fostering or hindering intellectual achievement. It is also important to realize that environmental earlier chat environmental stresses can have biological consequences, as has been reported in earlier chapters. Such factors as severe malnutrition, prematurity, and accidents at delivery, all of which are most associated with low socioeconomic status, can have lasting negative consequences for mental development. Unfortunately, as the child grows, disadvantages associated with poverty and ethnicity tend to be cumulative so that he fails and falls farther and farther behind in relationship to his peer group. This process can be observed in almost any school where there are children from poverty backgrounds. The child from such a background to tends to come to school with cognitive deficits because of his less favorable preschool experiences. He has probably seen fewer books, traveled less, had fewer verbal interchanges, and so on. The Head Start program was aimed at trying to supply some of these experiences by broadening the child's horizons. But it is doubtful whether 2 years of Head Start can make up for the neglect and lack of opportunity before and after nursery school. In school itself, the comparative lack of experience and supportive action at home helps cause the child to fail in the early grades. This is most likely to happen if the child also has intestinal parasites or is malnourished. With these early failures, his self confidence is impaired. Peace, guys. Oh, thank goodness. Yes. Thank you so much. Oh, much love. This is so good, right? We are doing it. Reading this wonderful and valuable information. We see where we are right now. Teacher expectations also enter into this picture, furthering the process since it is a truism that people tend to act as they are expected to act. A teacher often on what seems to him to be quite reasonable grounds, may be convinced that children from the minority and poverty backgrounds do not learn as fast or behave as well as children from more advantaged backgrounds. The results of such attitudes were demonstrated effectively in an elementary school in Northern California, where both teachers and pupils were unknowing guinea pigs. Students in all 18 classes of the school were given a standard battery of intelligence tests, which the teachers were led to believe had predictive value for identifying future academic blooming. Unknown to the teachers, the researchers then chose a random sample of about 20% of the children from each classroom and told the teachers that these children could be expected to show a burst of achievement. The teachers were also told to keep this information to themselves and not to tell the students. All the children were tested again at 4 and 8 month intervals, and a teacher rating was done on each of the students at the end of the year. The results were just as the teachers thought the test had predicted. The randomly selected academic bloomers bloomed. They were rated by their teachers as more interesting, curious, happy, and more likely to become successful in the future. These students also showed a more rapid gain on intelligence test scores, particularly in the ability to reason, than did their classmates. The experiment demonstrated how crucial the attitudes of teachers were in determining success. In addition to the cognitive and verbal deficits which accompany low socioeconomic status, the child with a minority identity also starts school with other disadvantages. By the age of 5 or 6, he often has developed feelings of racial prejudice against himself. Yikes. The present Black Power movement has proclaimed in a strident voice that Black is beautiful. This is an essential first step in developing a confident self-identity, but it will only be effective when it becomes an accepted statement rather than a battle cry. It will be even better when it does not have to be said at all because Black children will know that they are beautiful, just as white children know, for the most part, that they are beautiful. That day has not come, in spite of widespread popular beliefs that children do not know prejudice. A series of studies done by Kenneth and Mamie Clark found that preschool children were not only aware of their own racial identity, but that they had already acquired positive and negative feelings about that identity. The Clarks tested these feelings by presenting children with dolls of differing skin cut shades or having them color pictures with crayons. Quite consistently, Negro children chose light skins as more desirable and attractive. Yikes! Their comments indicated that they had not only learned that they were Negroes, but they were well aware of and believed in the negative stereotypes that accompanied such an identity. The findings of other researchers have supported those of the Clarks. In social, in social Oh, and sociometric tests in which children were asked to select the child in their class they would most like to play with or sit next to. Both white and Negro children tend to select white children. The denial of self as psychologically or physically beautiful was dramatically demonstrated one year in the early 1950s when the Negro newspaper, the Chicago Defender, unwittingly selected a white girl who was passing as a Negro as their beauty queen. The reasons for the choice were obvious. She had the fewest Negroid features of any of the candidates. Fortunately, the Black is Beautiful movement is working to change these stereotypes among young women. And in fact, some Negro girls whose hair is not particularly curly are now putting it up into tight pin curls each night in order to achieve the proper Afro look. Peace, everyone. Thank you so much. This is deep, right? Yes. Peace and highest heart love. We've heard about these studies done with the dolls and selecting who they want to sit next to or be friends with. And this is where that information came from these studies that we're reading in this book, currently in 2024, right? The end of 2024. So this is amazing that we get to revisit this and brush up on how we feel about ourselves and seeing how it correlates with poverty. The custom of human beings to search for their self identity in the reflected image of others places any despised minority group at a disadvantage when it comes to raising mentally healthy children. This is why racial prejudice has such serious consequences for mental health. Though there is little research about the evaluation of self that is made by Puerto Ricans or Mexican American children, it would seem that there would be similar forces at work as among as among Negroes, although perhaps not so severe. It is possible for the Puerto Rican to return to Puerto Rico and the Mexican American to visit Mexico to find a conscious self identity. a feeling which in the past has been denied to the Negro. Segregated schools also reinforce feelings of inferiority. In his comprehensive study of educational opportunities undertaken for the United States Office of Education, James Coleman concluded that segregated schools were very damaging to the minority children. His team measured 3 types of attitudes related to academic motivation. 1. An interest in schoolwork. 2. Self-concept regarding ability. And 3. A sense of control over one's own rewards. He found all 3 factors were related to an academic achievement, but the most crucial was the 3rd factor, control over one's fate. One's own fate. Negro children who felt the most powerless were the least likely to do well in school. As the proportion of the white students in the school enrollment increased, the Negro student felt better able to cope with the dominant white world, and both his feelings of control and his educational achievement increased. Unfortunately, the feelings of powerlessness, which develop out of a segregated experiences, have long-range consequences. In the Los Angeles study of housing segregation carried out by one of the authors of this book, it was found that the feelings of alienation, including powerlessness and enemy, kept even successful middle-class Negroes from making the effort to move to an integrated neighborhood, although they placed value on this kind of residence. The ghetto, in effect, builds its own walls because the feelings of alienation of the adults were more strongly related to childhood experiences with segregated schools and neighborhoods than to childhood economic deprivation. Now, this is very deep, guys. Check that out again. Because we hear this all the time. We hear this from people that are a little extreme, going to one side, and they say, oh, integration was the downfall. But we read right here. We read it right here that the integration and segregation has determinations on the mental. So, wow. Check this out. Here we go. I just want to read that last couple lines again, because that's very key, because it dispels a lot of the nonsense that people talk nowadays. To an integrated neighborhood. Negroes from making the effort to move to an integrated neighborhood, although they placed value on this kind of residence. The ghetto, in effect, builds its own walls because the feelings of alienation of the adults were more strongly related to childhood experiences with segregated schools and neighborhoods than to childhood economic deprivation. The apathy, the alienation, and the negative self-image created by poverty, prejudice, and discrimination carry over to health in both direct and indirect ways. If mental health is defined positively as a sense of psychic well-being rather than just the absence of certain debilitating behavioral symptoms, the person who has low self-esteem or who feels that he has no power over his own fate rates low on a continuum of mental health. More importantly, feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness act as barriers to people seeking preventative health care because planning seems useless. Thus, they are more likely to develop preventable physical illness and to wait until their illness has progressed so far that they require long-term hospitalization. These negative feelings also fit into other causal sequences which have consequences for health. The child whose achievement in school is blocked by his social class background or his minority status is likely to drop out of school before he is able to gain a useful occupational skill. This means that his later employment is marginal. The cycle then continues as he is unable to furnish a good environment for his children or to buy good health care in a society in which health care is a commodity to be bought, and the complex Gordian knot becomes even more impossible to unravel. Thank you all for being here. Highest heart love. Thank you so much for all the love. Oh my goodness. This is so key. We are all one essentially, and we have to come together. We have to uplift one another. We have to support the people in our community, right? We all have valuable skills. I love you. I love you. All right, here we go. The middle of page 140, chapter 7. Now, look at this. Anger. Apathy and withdrawal are the consequences of economic and racial discrimination. Anger is still another. The psychiatrists William Greer and Price Cobbs have described an ever-present gut-level rage as the outstanding race-related phenomenon they see in their Black patients. In the past, fear of violent reprisals and the conditioning for apathy and powerlessness has forced most Negroes to suppress overt expression of rage. However, as these barriers have begun to be dismantled, open violence has erupted. The race riots of the 19th and early 20th centuries differed significantly from the current ones in that the earlier ones were instigated by white gangs who invaded Black neighborhoods and attacked the residents, while the current ones are often instigated by Blacks. The 1935 Harlem and the 1943 Detroit riots originated in the Negro ghettos and were aimed at white-owned property. It was not until the decade of the 1960s, however, that Negro rioting reached almost epidemic proportion and focused public attention on the problem of the ghetto living. To study the riots, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. The commission, somewhat to the surprise of most of its liberal critics, reported that the basic cause of the riots was white racism. This racism translated into discrimination caused large numbers of Negroes to feel angry, frustrated, and cut off from any legitimate outlet. To solve the problems of the commission, the commission advised basic reforms in the administration of justice, the opening up of employment, housing, and educational opportunities, and a full-scale effort to lessen the level of frustration in the ghetto. In 1970 and 1971, there were similar outbreaks of violence in the Mexican-American barrios of Los Angeles, with similar root causes. From a mental health standpoint, it could be argued that the open expression of this rage is a healthier response than the continued forced repression. Although, from the standpoint of the public policy, the riots are no solution. It is interesting to note that while most ghetto residents understood and sympathized with the riots, usually only from 10 to 20% actively participated in them. In effect, most people continue to control or repress their anger with the system. Repression of anger, however, shows up in other ways. It has been argued that one of the consequences of this type of control of pent up anger is high blood pressure. Though few large-scale studies on the subject have been carried out, the fact that the rate of essential hypertension is much higher among the Negro population than among the white is suggestive of such a possibility. That makes sense though, right? We know pressure builds up, and that's what happens in the blood with hypertension, right? There's built up, pent up aggression and anger. Thank you all for being here. Welcome, welcome. That's right. Yeah, and heart disease. Exactly. Thank you so much, Miss Black Fox. That's real. Hi, it's heart love to you. All right, here we go. We're on the last couple pages. All right, so here we go. Bottom of page 141. Suicide, alcoholism, and drug addiction. Also unclear is the correlation of race and suicide. Even the statistics which relate socioeconomic status to suicide are not always consistent. Using data from England, Lewis Dublin found more suicides among the highest and the lowest social classes. In most American studies, a more simple correlation between low socioeconomic status and suicide has been found. Nevertheless, most authorities hold that sex and race are more significant than income when it comes to predicting suicide, although the psychodynamics and the precipitating cause of suicide tend to vary from one group to another. For example, more men than women kill themselves, and the stress which triggers their suicide tends to be work related, while those of women who destroy themselves are more often disturbed by marital or family problems. The epidemic proportion of suicide and suicide related behavior among Indians was pointed out in an earlier chapter. In order to explain this high rate, researchers turned to the concept of anomie, originated by Durkheim. In effect, rapid social and cultural change have left the Indians without the societal underpinnings which usually constrain people from committing suicide. The same explanation seems to account for the high rates among the foreign-born Americans, since immigrants are similarly cut off from the environment in which social norms were more stable and family relationships more available. Foreign-born males have a suicide rate that is almost double that of the population as a whole, while foreign-born females have a rate that is 74% higher than the female average. Woo! Contrary to expectations, however, suicide rates are not high among the major American ethnic minority populations of the United States. Born in Mexico, for example, have the lowest rate of any group of immigrants. 7.9 per 100,000 in 1960 compared to the national average of 10.6 per 100,000 in lower, wow, even lower is the general non-white ratio, including Negroes, of 4.5 per 100,000. Since most of the groups classed as non-white, including Orientals and Indians, have higher than average suicide rates, the Negro rate must be judged as very low. Suicide statistics, however, are misleading because what constitutes suicide is dependent upon what various officials define as suicide. In general, suicide is more likely to be reported in the North than in the South, and in urban areas than in rural areas. What constitutes suicide can also be debated. This causes difficulty not only for theorists but also for individuals who must decide as a part of their official duties whether an individual did or did not kill himself. To many people, suicide represents an escape from intolerable loneliness or the overwhelming problems of life. Escape is also possible through drugs or alcohol, so that it has been argued that alcoholism and drug addiction can also be forms of suicidal behavior. Obviously, such a conceptualization of suicide would change the statistical picture for minority group members. There is, for example, a fairly high rate of problem drinking among Negroes, and such drinking patterns can be a factor in accidental deaths and cirrhosis of the liver, or they can complicate other types of illnesses. The narcotizing effect of alcoholism is one way of dealing with frustration and helping one to escape from painful realities. Drinking is not confined to lower socioeconomic groups, and it seems also to be common among middle status Negroes. Most studies of drug addiction report that chronic users are likely to originate in the poorest neighborhoods and be members of minority groups. Addiction is rare in rural areas. It tends to be concentrated in the urban slums, and within these areas, the users tend to from the most miserable circumstances. Addiction, in fact, correlates highly with almost any form of human misery, including poverty, unemployment, broken homes, low education levels, and substandard housing. Even these common background factors, researchers are finding that no single explanatory principle can be completely account for the high incidence of narcotic use in the urban slums. People start using drugs for a variety of reasons, including feelings of failure, alienation, or emptiness. Then they continue with drug use to avoid withdrawal symptoms, or because the drug subculture gives them a way of life. Narcotics, which are readily available in the poverty neighborhoods, become an answer to feelings of hopelessness and frustration that otherwise seem to have no answer. Peace, everyone. Thank you for reading with us. This is so good. We're at the bottom now of page 143. Ha ha! Gotta love that. 143. I mean, I love you. There are, however, changes in the patterns of drug usage, particularly when it comes to the hallucinogenic drugs, the barbiturates, and marijuana, which have been adopted by a broader youth culture. At the present time, marijuana smokers are likely to come from higher income families with better educated parents. Probably in the period before 1960, the average marijuana user would have been black, lived in an urban slum, and suffered socioeconomic discrimination. The hallucinogenic drugs and barbiturates, on the other hand, had their beginnings with the youth culture rather than with the poverty population. Although deaths are common among barbiturate users, the opiates are more debilitating, and they remain the most common drug problem among minority group members. From this brief survey, it seems evident that the association of poverty and ethnic identity to mental illness is a complex one. The relationship between low socioeconomic status and the psychosis is clear, but diagnostic and treatment differences may be the reason for the correlation. Poverty and discrimination are obviously implicated as causal factors in school failures and in creation of a ghetto attitude, which is marked on one hand by an apathetic withdrawal and on the other hand by a bubbling anger, which can break through in a violent revolt. The Indian minority has a high suicide rate, but the Negroes, Puerto Ricans, and Mexican Americans are less likely to be victims of suicide unless the anesthetizing destruction of alcoholism and drug addiction are defined as suicide. There it is. The completion. Chapter 7. We only have 2 chapters left, guys. Of poverty, ethnic identity, and healthcare by Vern and Bonnie Bullough. I'm your moderator and narrator, Uriel NEVEU. Thank you all for being here for this reading. Hi, it's Heart Love. We will be going into Chapter 8 coming up. See that? Ooh, we only have 2 more chapters. We have Chapter 8 and 9 left. So, discrimination and segregation is next. So, love you guys. I love you. I love you. I love you. Thank you all for being here, man. Y'all are the best. I want y'all to have a wonderful, wonderful day. We are in Alaska. The final frontier, guys. Yeah. And I don't know if y'all caught that yesterday for those catching up, but I'm going to be doing a live session soon. It's going to be amazing. Y'all get to see why I'm so exclusive. I'm the only one that does what I do. So I'm going to bring you the whole thing too, because I'm about to get this next book published, and this next book is the harmonic vibrational. So I'll come out with the Your Healing Manual soon after that, but got to do things the right way, right? Oh, greetings from Spain. Hi, it's Heart Love. Jose. Oh, much love and honor. Hi. Peace, peace, guys. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Yes. Yes. Yep, I'm gonna be doing. I'm gonna go live like we're doing right now, and I'll have the client in the position. We'll do the harmonic vibrational with the your hailing, and you'll get to see why I get flown around the world to do what I do. So I want y'all to have a wonderful day. Thank you all for reading with us. And the highest heart, love, and honor. All right. Peace. Peace. Thank you so much. Oh, you guys are beautiful. Highest heart, love.